I would strongly encourage people to really thoroughly investigate the person of Jesus.
This podcast encourages and empowers you to create your own unique real story, develop your own unique real statement, and discover your own unique real self. The power is yours. Good afternoon, Chris Green. Previously, episode 405 of the 12-Minute Convos podcast. It's been just about 2 years, 8 months, 18 days, 3 hours, and 15 minutes since we last recorded.
Christians oftentimes are terrible messengers, and they do an incredibly poor job of representing the one that they believe in, because human beings are flawed. So if that's why you haven't thought about what you think about the person of Jesus, and it's because of something someone said or did that represents that faith, then I would ask them to take a second look.
That was then. This is now. Chris, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. So that's approximately how long it's been. That's very precise.
It's important to be precise, yeah?
I agree.
No, the last time we spoke, we had a pretty cool conversation. You were starting off with your podcast. You just got started, actually, which was like a couple of months before we recorded, which was super cool. How's that been going?
It's going really well. I don't know how many episodes I had done by then. You know, like you said, maybe I could have only been, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20. And I've done an additional 200 episodes since then.
Oh my, which was really cool when I took a peek on the website, because I saw at the time of this recording, you were at episode 212. And we love the number 12 here.
Of course. And the show has evolved tremendously since then.
It's intriguing with consistency what you can achieve, isn't it?
It really is.
I'm fascinated by how your episode 211 went, where you were walking down what seems to be, what was it, the office space or down the corridor where you were, where was that?
Oh, you're talking about Toph on the street, where we were investigating and trying to determine the most offensive soup. So yeah, I was...
That's super funny.
Yeah, I was walking around my office where I work.
It was super funny.
Thank you.
Where did the idea come for that? Like, is that something you guys do regularly?
It's not. It's only the second time that I've done something around the office like that, although I do record in the office quite a bit. That's where I am now. But the idea for venturing out to determine the most offensive soup, that actually happened that day at lunch. So I went to lunch with a friend of mine here in the office, and then we got into a conversation about it. And then he surprisingly had an answer for which soup do you think is the most offensive. And I thought, well, that's really interesting.
I think it's funny that you had the question, though.
Well, you know, when you're having lunch with a friend, you just don't know where your conversation's going to go. It could be that, or it could be something equally as strange, just in a different direction. But so I immediately came back to the office and grabbed my equipment and walked around the rest of the office to determine what other people's answers were to that same question.
Which was super funny. I mean, like, one guy spoke about cow tongue soup. And well, the guy, he was the Jewish guy, right? Like, he didn't like anything with pork.
That's right.
That's
right. So my friend Ivan is the one that I went to lunch with that kicked the whole thing off. And he's a 75-year-old Jewish man. So he eats kosher. So he doesn't eat anything with any kind of pork in it.
What would you say have been the rewards of being a podcaster, looking back from now to then?
I don't think that the rewards have changed since I started. I've originally started podcasting because I arrived at a point where I recognized that I needed a creative outlet. It was that in the beginning, and it continues to be that. So that's the reward, is that I'm continuously stimulated and it gives me a creative outlet. And I intentionally set up my show to be extremely flexible from a creative standpoint. So like I said, it's evolved tremendously since when I started, and it could take a sharp left turn at any time, and I don't have to start a new show. It could just be the same show, because that's the way I designed in the beginning. So instinctively, that was a good idea, and it remains to be. But the reward is that it's a creative outlet.
No, you set out to do that, right? Like, I remember vividly when you said that it's like Google. You set the name GravityBeard Podcast because you wanted it to be that. How has what you've been doing on the podcast impacted your 3 boys?
You know, I don't know that it has. I've tried to involve them in the show because small children can be very entertaining, and I did in the beginning, but I haven't really recently. Even peripherally, I don't know that it's really impacted them that much. Maybe when they're older and they have a better understanding of really what I'm doing, they might show interest in it. And if they do, I'll find a way to involve them in the show. But currently, I don't know that there's that much of an impact.
And as a husband, how has it affected your wife?
I think it probably in an obvious way. You know, when you take up a hobby that's this time consuming, you know, you have to carve out your time carefully so that it doesn't impact your partner too much in a negative way. And she's very generous and very understanding and gives me the time that I need. I think she recognizes how much I enjoy it. But you do have to be careful because podcasting can take over your life. So you have to be guarded about that.
What about the conversational side? Have you seen yourself, because as podcasters, we begin to edit as we talk, right? As we speak in conversations,
right.
It becomes a habit. How has that affected you and how your relationships are with your family and extensively with your friends as well?
Well, I've done a lot of interviews on my show, and I think partly that's because I'm a very curious person. So if I get into a conversation, even about something that's seemingly mundane, I'll still find interesting things, and I'll ask a lot of follow-up questions. So I think podcasting has continued to keep my brain kind of in that space. But also, when you hear yourself recorded, first of all, most people don't like the way they sound, and I'm among those. I don't think I sound great, but more importantly, I try to talk more slowly. When I listen back to myself, I talk very rapidly, or there's a lot of verbal pauses or those types of things. So I've tried to develop instinctively just talking a little more slowly and not have quite so many verbal pauses. Specifically, I think that's changed, but also just my conversations. It's hard for me not to approach a lot of conversations as an interviewer and be very inquisitive with people.
I've learned something over my conversations that I didn't understand when I just got started. I thought that verbal pauses was an indication of the person either being nervous, which it can be sometimes, or the person just didn't have that type of skill to speak on a recording. And then I realized that one of the other scenarios that can occur is that the individual weighs their response so heavily that they put thought into it and then they give the answer. And that in itself is something to be honored.
Sure. I think you're right about that. Also, one of my influences on my show is the local sports talk radio station here in town. And there's a guy on there in particular, which actually recently was a guest on my show, which I'm really excited about because I didn't think someone like that would come on my silly podcast. But I listen to him really closely and his style because he's been doing it for 25 or 30 years. And so he's one of my biggest influences just stylistically.
Now, you have a great love for music. How's that impacted the podcast?
The hardest thing for me as a podcaster is that you can't just use any music that you want to because it's licensed. And so I really struggle with that because I love hundreds and hundreds of songs and artists, and I would love to have a lot more music on my show, but you can't because you have to pay for it or you have to get permission or whatever. So there's still a huge inventory of royalty-free music out there for podcasters, but not the stuff that you grew up with or that you love. There's still a whole bunch of stuff you can't use.
No, it's been like almost 12, that the number 12 pops up again. It's almost 12 years since you've been married, right?
That's right. Actually, I just passed my 12th anniversary on July the 7th.
Oh, congratulations. Ooh,
thank you.
That's great. So you're still married. The 3 children, one was 4 at that time. So we're looking at 7, 5, and probably what, like 18?
Well, actually, I have 4 children now.
Wow, congratulations.
I had a daughter, almost 18, and then 7, 5, and 2.
Now, what's going on in their world?
Wow. The 18-year-old is heading into his senior year of school and getting ready to go off to college, and that's obviously very exciting. And then the others are just, boy, they're a handful. Young children. I can't overemphasize that enough. They impact our family in different ways, but 3 small children is overwhelming most of the time.
Now, where do you intend to go with your podcast? Is there just like the goal that you set where you wanted it to be something that was neutral? How do you see yourself evolving over the next couple of years?
Well, I think it'll always serve their original mission, which is it'll always be flexible and I can go anywhere with the show. And part of the answer, therefore, is I don't know where it's going to go in the future, but I do have goals because my co-host for one major portion of my show is moving much closer to me than where he was before. And I don't know if I can accomplish this, but what I would like to do is to do live performances of our show. And, I may have to start doing it in the corner of a sandwich shop or anybody that'll let me do a live broadcast at their business. But my goal would be to eventually do it in small theaters where a decent crowd shows up and pays to see us do our show. And that's going to take some time to develop a local following in both my town and the town where he's moving to. But I think it's possible. If we talked again in 2 years, I hope that I was doing occasional live performances.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'll check in like in a year's time, though. I'll not let 2 years pass by next time. Well, it's almost been 3 years, right? Like, I want to check in with my guests every year because I think it's more important. Recently as well, I lost 2 guests. I say lost because there are 2 guests that were on the podcast that passed. That affected me tremendously, and especially the way I found out. So I really want to be able to check in at least yearly, and we're working on our communication side to ensure that we have that back and forth conversation. So, we intend to be part of individuals' life that we have on the podcast. It's really about building relationships. It's a core concept of who we are as a family, as a business. So let's talk about you with the Jesus believer aspect of who you are. You said something really interesting at the end of our conversation the last time we spoke about individuals who may have had a Jesus believer tell them about Jesus and how that works. How's that been going?
That has not changed. That's still the core of who I am. And about not quite a year ago, we participated in a small church plant here in the town that I live in. And that's been great because along with that comes really high quality community, which I think is extremely important. I don't like to say a person needs this or needs that, so I'll stop short of that. But I will say that having a strong community around you in whatever form that it is that you find yourself in, community is just very important for a person or a family to have community. So it's been a really rich experience in that regard.
And I agree. Yeah, definitely that community layer is so important, and individual psychologically as well and spiritually. So thanks for sharing that. Well, my friend, I want to say thank you for what you have been doing, the fact that you did not be a risk-averse individual and you shot for the podcast and you did the podcast, and now you're continuing the podcast and you're having conversations that are both great and funny as well, right? Which is super inspiring to see and motivating to see that you've continued consistently. So I want to say thank you, Chris, again for what you're doing. It gives a great opportunity to be able to call in and hear you're doing what you're doing. Before we leave, is there anything else you'd like to share with our amazing audience?
Yeah, I do urge people to take a close look at the person of Jesus Christ, because people don't realize that usually what they don't like about religion is other people. Knowing Jesus and being involved in religion is 2 entirely different things. And so I would strongly encourage people to really thoroughly investigate the person of Jesus. I think absence of their opinions of human beings and how they negatively affect religion, I think they're going to discover something that's going to blow their mind.
Love it. Chris Green, again, a treasure, a pleasure. Thank you for being on What is Inspired by 12-Minute Convos with Angel Jones. This podcast is produced by Pod Edits. Visit podedits.com for professional podcast publishing.